Good evening and welcome to the latest in the FCC's Zoom events. I'm Rebecca Bailey. I am from AFP and one of the correspondent member governors. Our guest tonight, I'm sure to many of our audience, needs absolutely no introduction. Louisa Lim is a long-time Hong Konger and an esteemed journalist who's reported on China and Hong Kong for over a decade. She currently co-hosts the Little Red podcast, which actually as you might guess, is a podcast about China, an award-winning podcast about China, in fact. And she also teaches journalism at the University of Melbourne. Somehow, despite all of that other stuff, she has found time to write a book or another book, because as I'm sure many of you will have read, The People's Republic of Amnesia, her first book was shortlisted for many prizes, including the Orwell Prize for political writing. Her latest book is a subject close to many of our hearts, particularly at the moment. It's a history of Hong Kong from the perspective of locals. It's called Indelible City, Dispossession and Defiance in Hong Kong. It's deeply researched and very personal. It's just been published by Penguin Random House, and it casts startling new light on the city's origins of a place of refuge and rebellion. I won't give away too much more. I will hand you over to our moderator for the evening, FCC correspondent member governor Austin Ramzy of the New York Times. Just before I do though, I'd like to remind you, if you have any questions, please send them to question@fcchk.org. That's question, singular, at fcchk.org. And we will endeavour to field your questions to Louisa. But for now, over to you, Austin.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thank you, Louisa, for joining us tonight. We're here in the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong. It's World Press Freedom Day. It's in some ways a sad day. We learned that Hong Kong's rank in terms of press freedom plunged, according to Reporters Without Borders, 68 places to 148th place, now below Cambodia and a lot of places which traditionally have had very difficult environments for press freedom. Today is also a day that we would normally hand out the Human Rights Press Awards. The FCC suspended those this year. We did have some good news. We learned that Arizona State, the journalism program there, will pick those awards up and continue them on. Louisa, we were talking earlier, and you mentioned that you are a winner of the Human Rights Press Award in the past. So I was wondering if maybe I could just start and ask you about what your thoughts are today.
Oh, thanks, Austin, and thank you for hosting me. I am a winner of those awards. As you can see, actually, they're up on the shelf behind me, and I didn't even put them up especially for this. They're actually always there because I do feel really strongly about these awards. I think for me, they were the earliest awards. I got two up there. They were the earliest awards that I won on my own back as a correspondent. And they were covering really hard stories in Tibetan areas in China. And I just remember the sense of being recognized, that my work was being recognized and noticed. And I really value those awards. And I did think about cancelling this event in protest to the decision to suspend the Human Rights Press Awards, but I decided it would be better to have it in the interests of sort of open discussion and transparency. But I think it's a really sad day. Suspending the awards does feel like an abandonment of journalists at a time, and journalism and press freedom at a time when it's more important than ever before. And especially for our colleagues who have lost jobs like those at Stand News. In my book, I do write about the hollowing out of Hong Kong's institutions, and this feels like a hollowing out of the core mission of the Foreign Correspondents Club. So I think I understand it's a really hard decision, but I think it's a really sad day for the club itself.
Yeah, I can't speak on behalf of the board or the club, but I am a board member, at least for the next few weeks, and sort of just briefly offer my thoughts. I agree with you. I think it is a sad day. and reflective of the really difficult environment, the press freedom environment in Hong Kong. Keith Richburg, the board president, has a letter on the site today about Press Freedom Day and the awards, and he writes that he thinks the club can continue speaking out on matters of press freedom. I encourage people to check that out. I think the club is in a difficult position because of the environment in Hong Kong, because of its sort of split role as both a press club and a social club that has restaurants and bars and thousands of members and more than 100 employees. And, it's going to be tough going forward. I think the good thing, potentially good thing, is that this is all under discussion in the club now. The club is having its annual general meeting later this month, and I think these sort of subjects will be under a lot of discussion. So I encourage members to attend that and have all your questions answered and speak your mind. So moving on. Congratulations on the book. It's great, and a great follow-up to your previous book. Maybe if I could just start by asking about the King of Kowloon. Well, before I get to the King of Kowloon, that was the first thing on my mind, but let me ask the very first question. How did you decide to write this book, and what were you hoping to achieve with it?
Well, I grew up in Hong Kong, and I was always interested in writing a book on Hong Kong. I had an idea and I was working on it. And actually, weirdly, the FCC did play a part in how the book developed, because I had written a memoir piece that was published in an anthology of Hong Kong writers by Pen Hong Kong. And the launch event was actually held at the FCC. It was in 2017. It was meant to be at the Asia Society, but the Asia Society wouldn't allow Joshua Wong, who was in the anthology, to speak there. So they moved it to the FCC, which then was a place that welcomed anybody to speak. And we held the launch event there, and there were maybe 8 or 9 authors on the stage, including some fantastic Hong Kong poets like Nicholas Wong and Marco Yan. Joshua Wong didn't make it. He was occupying the Golden Bauhinia and was being arrested, so he didn't make it. But at a certain point in the Q&A, I remember someone in the audience asked the question, if I was to read one book about Hong Kong, what should I read? And we all sat on stage, all 8 or 9 of us, we all looked at each other. There was just this horrible silence. No one could, I don't know why, no one could think of any book when put on the spot. And eventually someone said, maybe Timothy Mo's Insular Possession, which was written in 1986, so a long time ago. And I just remember that point thinking, why aren't there 100 books about Hong Kong that are immediately springing to people's mind? How can it be possible that it's so hard to think of a Hong Kong book? And we were all guilty, none of us could think of one. So I decided that I wanted to write a Hong Kong book. I don't think it's the Hong Kong book, and I don't think any one book can be the book about such a sort of diverse and complicated place. I think there's, recently we've seen a lot of really good Hong Kong books come out, like Karen Zhang's beautiful memoir, The Impossible City. But yeah, after that, I started thinking about how to write a Hong Kong book. And I think that was something that kind of drove the way that the book developed.
That's great. Well, yeah, it feels like now could be a time for, 100 Hong Kong books to flower, a great moment for Hong Kong. Maybe that's not the right metaphor. A good time for Hong Kong books.
Fortunate metaphor, I think.
All right. Well, let me move to the question I previewed. The King of Kowloon has a big role in your book. Could you, I think most people listening to this probably have some sense of who he is, but could you, for those who don't, tell us a little bit about who he is and why you were interested in him, why you chose to make him a key figure in your book?
The King of Kowloon was really a feature of Hong Kong streets when I was growing up in Hong Kong. He was like, a feature of the city, and he was this elderly, sort of almost toothless, quite stinky trash collector who didn't wash very much, who was very famous. He believed that the peninsula of Kowloon had been stolen from his family when it was given to the British in 1860. And he had this sort of obsession about the land. And he spent, decades, almost half a century, writing his claims to the land over not just Kowloon, Hong Kong and Kowloon, and all over the place. But, it was very interesting. The writing he did was very contextual. He only ever wrote on Crown land or government land. So it was, the flyovers, the post boxes, the electricity boxes, all these bits of street furniture that you wouldn't normally notice. And he, in 1997, actually, I've got a picture that I can show, which is in my book here. And most of you will recognize the writing, if not the man himself. And, he would paint on the same sites over and over again. So the government cleaners would come and clean them away or paint over them, and he would return to the same sites. And then in 1997, he was given an art exhibition by Lau Kin Wai. And after that, he became, more of an artist. His work toured. He was in exhibitions at Han Art. Eventually, he represented Hong Kong in the Venice Biennale. And, he became this real icon. He was in a lot of local films playing cameo roles. Singers sang songs to him, poets wrote odes to him. He was in adverts for a cleaning product called Swipe, a really famous advert. Weirdly, Louis Vuitton, he was in an advert for that. And, he kind of became a commodity. His work was on haute couture fashion and duvet covers and, underwear and everywhere. And I was just really fascinated in him. I think there were several levels. One of it was personal. His work really spoke to me. It reminded me of, that time when I was a child in Hong Kong. But also, there was another political side to his work that I just found really interesting, that in his lifetime, and particularly early on, people had thought he was completely crazy. And even at the time when he died, no one was really interested in the sort of content or the political message of his work. But actually, he was talking about these Hong Kong preoccupations long before other people were, territory, sovereignty, dispossession and loss. And, if you look back now at what he did, some people who were sort of writing about him early on, they call him a prophet, a seer, a shaman. I don't know that he was, but I just think in a way he gave Hong Kongers a way to think about these issues, because he was doing it way before anybody else was.
It's interesting. A month ago, a King of Kowloon work sort of reappeared on Boundary Street, and it was interesting to see the reaction. I remember his work from when I first lived in Hong Kong in the early 2000s, and even before I knew who he was sort of this very distinct style of writing. Was really just part of the landscape, and would appear, in so many places. I remember being on the electrical boxes that sort of like controlled the lights and stuff like that. And I think I saw it for a long time before I sort of understood who he was and what he was. I wonder though, like if you followed this reappearance of a work of his and the reaction, and what you make of that. How do you think he's sort of seen in Hong Kong today, and what sort of relevance does he have in Hong Kong today?
I think many people of a certain age, he kind of talks to people in a way because he was such a fixture of the landscape. And, I know that piece of work that's reappeared since it's reappeared. Everyone keeps telling me that people keep sending me pictures of loads of people taking pictures of it. It seems there's like a constant crowd of people around it taking pictures of it. So I think there's something in his work which is quite symbolic. And I this was actually the question that I kept asking all my interviewees. Why? Because it's not. I was quite obsessed with him, but then I found this whole sort of subsection of people who had written about him and knew him and had interviewed him or painted with him or whatever. And I kept asking the same question, and I was quite struck by the sort of personal nature of the answers. People would say things like, he's part of all Hong Kong people. And I think there's something to do with the idea of collective memory, that he really represents the sort of collective memory of Hong Kongers. I mean, when he died, there was just newspaper coverage everywhere. It was across the political spectrum. Even the Wen Wei Po was carrying coverage of him. And so I think that he had become this figure that in a way really symbolized something in the Hong Kong mindset, both this sort of defiant streak, but also this free thinking streak. The journalist Feng Manyi described him as the last free man in Hong Kong. And I think that's quite a beautiful description as well. So I think there's something in his sort of rebellious, defiant streak that really speaks to Hong Kongers. And I think the reemergence of his work is really interesting. I think there will be more work reemerging. I think it's all part of a campaign.
Interesting. Well, one of the things that comes clear through your book is just how his sort of unique mindset, and particularly in the sense that he seems to not really care at all what anyone thinks about him or what he does. That he's arrested repeatedly. People criticize his calligraphy or say it's not even calligraphy, that it's just scrawl and so many things, and yet he's has this incredible focus on doing this for decades. And it made me think about like Hong Kong today. I mean, what do you think a figure like King of Kowloon, what would happen to him if he were trying to do that on the streets of Hong Kong today?
Oh, I think it would be really different. He was fined quite a lot, and police officers used to come and try and stop him from writing, and he would sort of fly into a rage and shout abuse at them. But there were stories in the Chinese press saying that in the last few years of colonial Hong Kong, that the police had actually had this sort of unspoken agreement that they wouldn't arrest him. I could never confirm whether that was true or not, but it was certainly written about. But that kind of graffiti now would be a very different proposition. And even in 2019, there was someone who wrote political graffiti on a street sign near an MTR station. And I think they were arrested. Their house was raided. I seem to remember their father was arrested at a certain point as well. And one of the reasons was that it was on public property. Another reason was because it was a political slogan. And that was even before the passage of the national security legislation. I don't know how someone like the King of Kowloon would be dealt with now, but at a time when we are seeing speech crimes that never existed before in Hong Kong existing. And, I think a third of those people that have been arrested under the national security legislation have been arrested for speech crimes. I don't think there would be much tolerance for a character like him anymore, for sure.
Yeah, well, it certainly, graffiti of all types disappears pretty quickly, and particularly anything with political content. So, I don't want to fill this all up with questions about King of Kowloon, but could I just ask one last thing since we're here? What I mean, since you mentioned that the protests, I mean, one big feature of the protests was the way that the city was covered with graffiti and linen walls and all sorts of messages. Did you have a sense that there was an interplay or between the King of Kowloon and what people were doing, both in 2014 during the Umbrella Movement and the protests that started in 2019? If he inspired people or he affected how people saw the landscape of the city?
I don't necessarily think people were consciously thinking about the King of Kowloon in any way. Many of the protesters, I think, both in 2014 and 2019 would, he died, they were born, some of them would have been born after he died, probably. So I don't necessarily think that he was a direct influence, although I do remember there was some graffiti, there were some illustrations in 2014 when the first Lenin Wall was shut down. There were some illustrations that a cartoon that included him. So I think at that time maybe some older sort of political satirists were thinking about his role. But I think I couldn't help thinking about him, and particularly after it moved away from Lenin walls and to sort of actual sort of spray painted graffiti on the walls of, the Legislative Chamber on July the 1st in 2019 and later on in the streets. I mean, he really was the first person to write political graffiti in Hong Kong. He was one of the world's earliest famous street artists, before Banksy, before Keith Haring. But, the fact was that his was very political content. So I think, maybe there was some sort of unconscious drawing on what he'd done, but I don't think it was necessarily a conscious thing.
Moving on to the book is quite personal, and you sort of right from the beginning about you're thinking about your role as a journalist, and sort of changing your role as a journalist or as a sort of participant in the book. So I wonder, how you think now about yourself and your role, and what it's like, to be a journalist, if you feel that you've somehow gone beyond the sort of become sort of more of a participant in the story.
Yeah, I think many of us, many journalists kind of struggled with how to write about the protests in 2019, particularly when they first started. I think there was a tension between being a Hong Konger and that kind of traditional role of being a very stand back, neutral observer in what was happening on the streets. And as time went on, I began to feel quite dissatisfied, to be honest, with the way that the protests were being reported. Particularly in the local media, I would be there on the streets watching, and then the next day you would read the reports, and they would very heavily quote a lot of government officials using words like rioters, not mentioning any police brutality, not mentioning sort of all kinds of things. And you would also see that kind of tension in the work that other journalists were doing, in the difference between what they're posting on their Twitter feeds and the stories written under their bylines, particularly if they're working for local media, local newsrooms. And I know that other journalists, it's incredibly hard if you, you have to earn a living, and working in a Hong Kong environment, maybe there were demands placed on your newsrooms, but I was not in that position. I wasn't beholden to anybody. And I just decided that I didn't want to write that kind of journalism. I felt that this sort of slavish devotion to even-handedness, to always quoting the government and the police, was coming at the expense of fairness and accuracy. Nowadays it will kind of be akin to every time you write a story about Ukraine, quoting a Russian official in that story, every single story, every time. And I didn't want to do that because I didn't think that it was necessarily accurate or fair. So I decided to write as transparently as I could, and that's what I did.
You also talk about your time sort of when you first started out as a journalist, and you were covering the handover and that experience. And I wonder what it was like for you to sort of go back and sort of revisit that event and think about, how you thought about it then, how you thought about it in hindsight, what it was like to sort of think through your previous work like that and the experience itself like that.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting to go back. And, I did not feel like any of my work in any newsroom in Hong Kong covered me with glory in any way. I mean, also, it is the nature of news, right? You're doing very short, 1 minute, 30 pieces. How much can you fit into that? But yeah, I don't know that we, I think we were often so caught up with what's happening at this moment that we never really thought about the bigger story. In particular, the story that we covered was the withdrawal of the British. It was not the return to Chinese sovereignty in any way. And I don't think we adequately thought about what that meant or prepared for it in any way. We had minute by minute rundowns of the British withdrawal and, where Patten would be at any point in time, where his daughters were, this kind of thing. But when it came to July the 1st, no one knew what was happening. I remember going into the newsroom and no one had any clue what was going on. No one was on duty because everyone was so tired after all the rolling news coverage. And I just don't think we ever really thought about what happens next. And I think that mindset was really problematic.
Yeah, in a way, in many ways, that's when the story sort of starts. But another sort of very personal aspect you brought in was your mother and her own research and the experience of being dragged to all these temples and sites around Hong Kong as a child, and maybe not fully appreciating at the time what she was doing or wishing you were somewhere else. Can you tell us a little bit about what she researched and how it came to affect your thinking and writing of this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So my mother, Patricia Lim, she was actually a Latin teacher. And in her spare time, actually after she retired, she started writing these cultural heritage guidebooks to Hong Kong. And really the only reason that she did was because she wanted this kind of guidebook and she couldn't find one anywhere. And eventually she said, oh, well, I'll just write one myself. And so, as a child, I had spent all of my weekends being dragged to look at these sort of study halls and really dusty temples and walled villages and sort of sacred trees somewhere in the New Territories. And, all I wanted to be doing was like sunbathing and shopping and, going on junks and doing fun things. And it was sort of desperately unglamorous and quite boring and quite hard work, sort of, trekking out in the New Territories past all these dogs and, and I didn't really appreciate it at all at the time. But I think what she did instill in me was this idea of a sort of, this pre-existing heritage and how important that was. There was not a colonial heritage. And then she moved on to the graveyard in Happy Valley. And if there's any graveyard enthusiasts, she's written a very long book, which is 600 pages long and sort of extraordinarily detailed. But it's she was originally only going to write a little pamphlet about the graveyard, just saying where the interesting graves were. But it actually took her 10 years. And she went back and found all the letters and the diaries of people buried in the graves, and ended up writing this sort of, it's like a history of early colonial settlement, but it's told through those people buried in the cemetery. So it's not, it's a social history, but not told through the elite, through the kind of soldiers and the shopkeepers and the sex workers and the people who are buried there. And again, it's, you know, I think she was quite, she is quite interested in kind of looking at the parts of Hong Kong history that other people at the time were also getting interested in, but, you know, there wasn't a lot of work on them at the time. And I think all of that fed into my book. In really real ways as well. I mean, she gave me her entire library, which is a lot of extremely heavy books, sort of early colonial history books. And, you know, I read all of them and, you know, we talked a lot about them. And I think that was really important in sort of helping me think through, you know, it really I had this foundation that I didn't really know was there until I started writing.
You also, you know, you talk about your father who worked in the colonial administration, and other family members and ancestors who had roles in Hong Kong's development and history at various points. What was that like? What was it learning about, you know, what your family did here?
Oh, it was a really interesting process. I hadn't really ever known exactly what they had done, you know, and there were sort of ancestors and quite distant relatives who had played sort of quite, you know, small supporting roles in Hong Kong's history along the way. And it was sort of quite shocking to find out exactly what they'd done. You know, one example is the governor, Francis Henry May, who's known as Henry May. And, you know, I'd always known that he was related to me. And, you know, I used to boast about it when I was in school in Hong Kong, you know, because our school was near May Road, which was named after him. And I didn't realize that he's sort of popularly known as one of the most racist governors that Hong Kong has ever had. You know, he had a pony called Yellowskin. He was the one who put through legislation that banned non-white people, non-Europeans from living on the Peak. He actually didn't even want mixed race children like me to go to schools where European children went. And, you know, he wrote in his notes, in his letters, about Chinese as a semi-civilized race. And it was quite shocking that, you know, I always knew that governors had, you know, discriminated a lot, put through all this very discriminatory legislation against Chinese people, but to find out that one of your own relatives had sort of really hit closer to home than one would want.
Wow. And so you learned this as you were reporting the book?
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, maybe there were members of my family who knew, but I guess it's not something that you would want to talk about that much.
Wow. That's amazing. One other really fascinating part of the book was your work with the interviews that Steve Zong did with officials and advisors at the time of the handover. Interviews that they sort of gave knowing that they wouldn't be public for a long time after. You know, what did you learn in there? How did you see that sort of fitting in thematically with the book?
Yeah, it was a really interesting discovery that I just kind of chanced across. You know, I was reading Steve's book that my mother had given to me. It was a really old, dusty copy. And buried in the footnotes, he said, I'd really like to thank all those people who spoke to me, even though their words couldn't be used at this point in time. They really informed my thinking. And so I went back and I was like, he did mention the Hong Kong Transition Project. So I started to look for what this was. And I found that there were all these interviews being held in a library, in the Western Library in Oxford. And some of them had been placed on the shelves. And you could only read them in the reading room in Oxford. This was pre-COVID. So I kept having to go to Oxford to read the interviews. And there were a lot of interviews, and some of them were very, very long. And then I went on a couple of trips, and then I went to Steve, and I showed him the list of interviews that had been released. And he said, oh, that's really funny. I'm sure that I interviewed other people too, whose names aren't on that list. So I went back to the library, and they discovered all these other interviews that they hadn't put on the shelves. And actually, some of that was too late for my reporting, but there's a lot of incredible archival material there that has not been well used, that I think really puts a different light on Hong Kong's own history. And I think for me, the important thing was restoring Hong Kong voices to that period of Hong Kong history. And I mean, actually, there were a lot of interviews, both with senior civil servants, colonial ones, and with governors, but the ones that I was interested in were the unofficial. So UMELCO, the unofficial advisors to the Executive Council and to LegCo as appointed by the governor. And the period that I was interested in was 1982 to 1984, when the Joint Declaration was being negotiated. And the interviews were really frank. They were interviews with people like S.Y. Chung and Li Fukuo and Roger Lobo. So they were sort of industrialists and lawyers and bankers who were supposed to advise the British, but who ended up being extremely dissatisfied with the way the British had conducted the negotiations and the Joint Declaration itself, but had been really used by the British to sell the Joint Declaration to Hong Kongers. The British feared that if, there could be an exodus, Hong Kong, confidence in Hong Kong could collapse. And they needed the unofficials to really kind of show continuing confidence in Hong Kong and in this agreement and really talk it up. But privately, the unofficials were extremely unhappy. They, at a certain point, S.Y. Chung said, I didn't like the agreement. No one did. They felt that the British had not negotiated hard enough. They felt the British didn't understand how to negotiate with the Chinese. There were no native Chinese speakers on the British team, so they felt sometimes they missed the language. They felt they didn't understand negotiation with the Chinese. At one point, S.Y. Chung said, if I was in London and I was in Harrods, I couldn't bargain. But with Chinese, the process of shopping is completely different. The agreement, that is just the beginning of negotiations, not the end. And they were very dissatisfied with the lack of safeguards or any monitoring mechanism for the Joint Declaration. And they really had lobbied hard for that. So for me, it was more a question of sort of restoring that Hong Kong voice to history. And I think there's a great deal of scope for a lot of other work on it. There's an awful lot of archival material there. Steve did an incredible job. I just felt that throughout Hong Kong's history, the voice of Hong Kongers just hasn't been present at all. When I started working on this project, I actually went to see a friend of my mother's, a historian called Tim Ko. And he said to me, in Hong Kong's history, there are no Chinese faces, no Chinese voices. And, in colonial history, that was certainly true. The history books are just laundry lists of governors and what they did. And so I wanted to try and reinsert those voices. But I think there's a great deal of work still that can be done on that archive that would be really interesting. And there's, all kinds of interesting tidbits that are in those interviews that I hadn't known. S.Y. Chung himself had a death threat after he came back from Beijing. and he was really anxious about it. He thought that the death threat was designed to muzzle him, to stop him from speaking on behalf of Hong Kongers. And he believed that it had come from China somewhere. But, you know, he couldn't publicly say anything. And none of the things that they spoke about to Steve Chung were things that they could talk about publicly, because they'd, of course, signed the Official Secrets Act. So I just found all of those interviews to be fascinating.
That part was very interesting. You also spoke with Chris Patten, the last colonial governor, who's an incredibly savvy politician, but you sort of got him to sort of, there was a moment of felt like real honesty in that interview. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was, so I did ask him about the unofficials and about that whole period in history. I was really interested in his view on that, because of course he's the one person, or one of the few people, who would have read all the papers before he went out to Hong Kong in his briefing period. So he would have known about, all the difficulties and problems that they had raised and their dissatisfactions they had had. So I did ask him, whether it would have made any difference if they had been listened to. And he, to my surprise, said, I think it might have, but he didn't really expand on how. So I thought that was very interesting. And then there was this moment in our interview when I showed him some graffiti that I saw on the wall. I think it was on National Day in 2019, and it was graffiti of the speech that he gave on the night of Hong Kong's return to Chinese sovereignty, when he said, I was trying to remember the exact words. He said, so the graffiti, which was his speech, said, "Now Hong Kong people are to run Hong Kong. That is the promise, and that is the unshakable destiny." And I showed him this piece of graffiti, and I said, "How does that make you feel?" And it was the one moment that I felt was a really honest moment, because he just kind of stopped talking, because until that moment he was so polished and such a politician still, and he just kind of bowed his head right down to the desk, so it was almost touching the table, and he just went bad, 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 like this. And I almost thought he was going to cry. It was a really I felt like it was a really honest moment, so I wrote about that.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem, with the discussion of the unofficials and the sort of history that hasn't really come out in your earlier book on Tiananmen, that there's this underlying theme of things that the powers that be don't really want the public to know. I mean, do you see that as sort of your mission in going into these books, to find those truths?
Not really. In each case, I guess I almost stumbled across things in the course of my reporting that have not been reported before. I guess it would be very neat and easy to say, yes, that's my mission, and I go into it with grand ideas. That's really not true. I'm always looking in the places where people are not looking. I'm never really that interested in writing the kind of stories that everybody else writes. And I guess maybe that's why I stumble across, often I'll follow a thread and keep following it until it leads me to something. And it could take a really, really long time. I mean, each of these books, this book was 8 years in the writing. And, I never feel like they're really finished. There's so much more that I did not write about. There were so many other interviews that I didn't manage to get to, especially in the archive. So, yeah, I guess it would be nice if that was my mission, but I guess it's almost like an accidental kind of outcome. And maybe I end up writing about things that haven't been written about before, just because not necessarily looking in the obvious places for stories.
Well, it's a great outcome. So we're in the last 15 minutes of the hour when we go to questions from the audience. So I have a question here from Shibani Matani. She's a Washington Post correspondent here in Hong Kong. She writes, given you write so much about self-censorship and the disappearance of civil society in Hong Kong, do you see the FCC's decision to cancel the Human Rights Press Awards and also to hold off on statements on journalist arrests as part of this broader remaking of all institutions in Hong Kong, including the media? And then a follow-up, do you think these institutions risk being complicit in normalizing a declining situation in Hong Kong?
Yeah, those are really tough questions, and I will say something, and then maybe you have something to say as well, Austin, as a board member. But I do think I do think not. It's such an important role that a press, an organization that is supposed to be fighting for press freedom can play in issuing statements when its members have trouble, and that's not a small thing. It's a really important role because it's also alerting foreign governments to what is happening in Hong Kong. And I think for journalists themselves, it's such an important role. It's such an important thing to feel that there is someone who is watching when things go wrong. So I do think any decision to hold back on statements is an act of self-censorship. And in an organization that is supposedly has press freedom as its core mission, that it is a hollowing out of the mission, and yeah, it's as I said, I have written about how sort of institutions are being hollowed out, so they look like everything looks the same on the surface, but are they actually performing the functions they're supposed to be performing? I think the FCC needs to really think about what function that it has if it's not advocating for press freedom and supporting its members vocally and openly. Austin, maybe you've got something to say about this as well.
Yeah, let me just say, if anybody has a question, to please send it to us at question@fcchk.org. Yeah, I mean, in reading a book, I was really reminded of that. There was a part where you describe going to, I think it was a court of final appeal for a decision on something, and and this is part of your sort of examination of your role as a journalist, and the line was something like Hong Kong's institutions were being hollowed out, and my own role in it nauseated me, but it's also hard to know what to do. Yeah, that was a line that did resonate with me. Yeah, it's a very difficult situation. You and I were both in Beijing at a similar time. I imagine you were probably also a member of the Foreign Correspondents Club of China as well, which is it's a very different organization. It's just made up of journalists. It's just focused on journalists' interests. The FCC here, it has that press club role, but it also has a social club with many other things going on, and employees, people to worry about, and it's I think it does sort of make that sort of pure press club role difficult. I mean, it's hard enough for the FCC China with their sort of very small profile, when I was there, I think they had one part-time person or something like that. And even then, they're regularly denounced by the foreign ministry as an illegal organization, and it's tough for them. And Hong Kong is becoming a lot more like like the mainland environment. So it's tough. I don't know the answer. I feel like it's going to be hard for the FCC Hong Kong going forward to speak on press freedom rules, on issues of press freedom. But what do? Do you try and muddle through, speak on some things, not on others? Do you throw up a white flag and not speak on anything? It's all pretty fraught. I mean, I guess the best thing is that these issues are being discussed now, and the what's happening with the club, is a matter of pretty intense debate. So I hope through that we reach a consensus and have some thought about what to do in the future, but it's not easy. All right, more questions for you. Let's see, where does one find your book in Hong Kong? I went to S-Lite, and they told me they didn't. I did get a copy on Kindle, but I wanted to get a print copy. They told me it was not available, and they did not expect it to be.
From my understanding, from what my publisher has told me, the main chains in Hong Kong are not stocking the book. My understanding is because of this slogan on the book, that this is seen as problematic. So I would say probably your best bet for getting hold of the book in Hong Kong is to buy it on Kindle, or as an audiobook, where it is available at the moment. But I don't see any, I don't think that it's that likely that it's going to be stocked by major chains in Hong Kong. It has just been acquired by a Taiwanese publisher, so it will be printed, it'll be translated and printed in Taiwan, which is really, really nice. I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, it's a pity. I would, really like it to be available in Hong Kong, but unfortunately not at the moment.
Well, beyond that, what's been the reception? Have you heard from readers in Hong Kong, and what do people think about it?
Well, I mean, it's only just been published. I think it's been out for maybe 10 days in the US, and then published actually today elsewhere in the world. So so far the feedback has been quite good. But yeah, interestingly, I wrote a piece for the Financial Times at the weekend. I think it came out on Saturday, about Hong Kong communities in exile, and writing and researching Hong Kong from exile. And that piece had a really I just got an avalanche of feedback. I just had a lot of messages from people I didn't know, telling them, made people cry at their desks at work. Lots of people wrote to say how it had moved them. There was a reader in Sydney who said it made him weep like a baby, and he was going to he said he was a father of 3, and he was going to make sure that all 3 of his children read it. Yeah, I had a lot of response from that. And the other thing that really interested me was that the trolls on the Financial Times website were extremely active. They were all over it. There were a lot of comments from trolls about it. So it struck all kinds of chords that I hadn't really expected.
I didn't realize the FT's website had that many trolls.
Apparently they've got very active Chinese trolls, and also Russian trolls too. So literate trolls who can afford FT subscriptions, apparently.
Well, trolls aside, I mean, what do you make of that response from readers? Why, I mean, aside from your wonderful writing, why were they so moved?
mean, I think we are seeing these new communities of Hong Kongers in exile really coalescing in a way that they hadn't before. You know, and I think part of it is also, some of it is because of the protests, but also, you know, this big outflow now is because of the zero COVID policies. I did read 150,000 people have left since the end of last year. So there are these brand new communities, and I think there's this real sense of loss, you know, of being discombobulated and in a new place and not knowing what comes next. But also, and it might also come back to the point that Shabani Matani was making in her question. When, you know, when there are these moments, and we particularly had it in Australia when they had a showing of Kiwi Chow's Revolution of Our Time. When the community comes together, I think it could be really powerful. And one of the things that I think was really obvious in that film was the way in which the national security legislation is really atomizing civil society. It's kind of designed to dissolve those bonds between Hong Kongers. And, you know, even watching the film in the cinema, those were the moments that made people cry. Those were the moments that really moved people when they saw Hong Kong people putting their lives at risk for complete strangers, people they didn't know who were other Hong Kongers. And I think that's the sense of what is being lost, that sense of connection, that sense that there is, you know, there are all these parts of society that will help other people even if they don't know them. And I think, you know, I guess it also comes back to the FCC's. That's one of the reasons why I think the FCC's decisions to not speak about, you know, Alan Au's arrest and things like that are so devastating in a way, is because those bonds, you know, have been so strong in the past. And to see them disappear, I think, is really devastating. And I guess just writing about it and thinking about it and articulating that sense of loss makes it very real and brings it out into the open.
Well, Louisa, we're coming up on the end of the hour. So I thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us, and congratulations. Congratulations on your book. Again, it's Indelible City, Dispossession and Defiance in Hong Kong. Yeah, you can get it on Kindle.
Hopefully now. Well, thank you so much for hosting me at the FCC, and thank you, there's so many people, for turning up.
Good night.